A truck driver runs straight into a wall of flames on the side of a highway because he hears something screaming inside the smoke, and when he stumbles out moments later with his arms wrapped around a trembling baby fox, he has no idea that 2 years from now on a frozen mountain road with his truck overturned and his body pinned inside the wreckage and not a single person around for miles, that same fox will appear out of the darkness and do something that no one can explain, something that will save his life in a way that still makes him cry every time he tells this story. So how did a man who had lost everything find hope in the eyes of a wild animal? And how did that animal remember him when it mattered most? Because what happens next will remind you that some bonds are never broken, not by time, not by distance, not even by the silence of the wild. And this is the story of Ray Colton, a man who thought he had nothing left to give until he gave everything to something that couldn't even say thank you. Ray was 53 years old when this story began, and he had been driving trucks across America for nearly 26 years, which meant he knew every curve of highway from Texas to Montana, every truck stop that served decent coffee at 3 in the morning, and every stretch of road that felt lonelier than the last. And if you had asked him back then whether he was happy, he probably would have laughed and changed the subject, because the truth was Ray had stopped thinking about happiness a long time ago, not because he didn't want it, but because life had slowly taken away every version of it he once knew. His wife had left him 9 years earlier, not in anger but in exhaustion, because she said she couldn't keep loving a man she only saw 4 days a month, and the worst part was he understood, and that made it worse, because he couldn't blame her and he couldn't stop driving, and so he let her go with a nod and a quiet goodbye that still echoed in his chest every time he passed through Nebraska where they had gotten married. His daughter had grown up while he was on the road, and now she lived in Portland with her own family, and they talked sometimes but not enough, never enough, and every birthday he missed still felt like a brick in his stomach. Ray wasn't a broken man, but he was worn down, like a highway sign that had been hit by too many storms, still standing but faded, still legible but tired. And that who he was the night he was driving through a stretch of Wyoming wilderness in late September when everything changed. The sun had just gone down and the sky still held that orange glow on the horizon, and Ray was sipping cold coffee and thinking about nothing in particular when he noticed something strange up ahead, a haze in the air that didn't look like fog. It was too orange, too thick, and as he got closer his headlights caught the edges of smoke drifting across the road like ghosts trying to escape something terrible. He slowed down because he had to, because the smoke was getting thicker and he could see other vehicles pulling to the shoulder and people stepping out to look, and that's when he saw it. A wildfire had broken out in the forest just off the highway, probably sparked by lightning or a careless camper, and it was spreading fast through the dry brush, throwing flames into the trees like it was trying to climb the sky. Ray pulled his rig to the side and stepped out, and the heat hit him immediately, not close enough to burn but close enough to make his skin tighten, and he stood there watching like everyone else, waiting for sirens, waiting for someone official to arrive and tell them all what to do. But in that moment something cut through the noise of the fire, a sound he almost didn't catch, a high-pitched cry, like a scream but smaller, like something desperate and terrified was calling out from inside the flames. He thought maybe he imagined it, because who could hear anything over the roar of a fire? But then he heard it again, and this time he knew it was real, and something inside him shifted, something that hadn't moved in years, and before he could talk himself out of it he was walking toward the fire, then jogging, then running, and he didn't even know what he was running toward, only that something alive was burning and he couldn't just stand there and watch. The heat got worse with every step, and smoke filled his lungs and made him cough so hard he almost fell, and his eyes burned and watered until he could barely see, but he kept moving because the crying was getting louder and he knew he was close. And then through the haze he saw it, a tiny shape huddled against a rock near a fallen tree that was already catching fire, a baby fox, no bigger than a loaf of bread, with wide terrified eyes and singed fur and nowhere to go because the flames had circled around and cut off every escape. Ray didn't think, he just moved. He pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around his hands and scooped the fox up before it could run or bite, and the animal screamed and squirmed, but he held on, tucking it against his chest and turning back toward the road. And the fire was louder now and the smoke was everywhere and he couldn't breathe and he couldn't see, and for one horrible second he thought he was going to die in those woods with a baby fox in his arms. But then he saw headlights through the haze and he ran toward them like they were the last hope in the world, and somehow he made it. Somehow he stumbled back onto the gravel shoulder and collapsed onto his knees while other drivers rushed over to help him. The fox was still in his jacket, shaking so hard it felt like a heartbeat against his chest, and Ray just held it there, coughing and crying and not caring who saw, because in that moment all he felt was relief, not just for the animal but for himself, like saving this small life had reminded him that he was still capable of doing something good. Someone handed him water and he drank it without thinking, and a woman wrapped a blanket around his shoulders even though he kept saying he was fine, and the whole time time the fox stayed curled against him, not struggling anymore, just breathing, just trusting, and when their eyes met something passed between them that Ray couldn't explain, a recognition maybe, or a gratitude that didn't need words, and he knew that whatever happened next, he would never forget this moment. The firefighters arrived about 20 minutes later and got the blaze under control before it reached the highway, and a wildlife officer eventually came and told Ray they would take the fox to a rehabilitation center, and Ray nodded because he knew it was the right thing to do, but when he handed the animal over he felt a strange pull in his chest, like he was letting go of something that had only just begun. He watched them put the fox in a carrier and drive away, and then he climbed back into his truck and sat there in the dark for a long time, just staring at his hands, which were red from the heat and smelled like smoke, and he didn't cry but he came close, and when he finally started the engine and pulled back onto the highway he carried something new with him, a feeling he hadn't had in years, a feeling that maybe he still mattered, maybe his life still had meaning, even if he couldn't see it. Most days, the weeks after that night blurred together the way time always did on the road, miles becoming days and days becoming miles, and Ray kept driving because that's what he knew how to do, but something had shifted inside him, something quiet but real, and he found himself thinking about the fox more often than he expected, wondering if it had survived, wondering if it remembered him, and knowing deep down that the answer probably didn't matter because wild animals don't remember people, they just survive. He tried to tell himself it was just instinct, just a moment of adrenaline, but every time he passed through Wyoming he looked out at the tree line and wondered if somewhere in those woods a small fox was running free because of him. Winter came hard that year, and Ray found himself hauling freight through the northern routes more than usual because the pay was better and he needed the money. His truck had needed repairs and his daughter's birthday was coming up and he wanted to send her something nice, something that showed he was still thinking about her even if he didn't know how to say it, and so he took jobs that other drivers avoided, long hauls through mountain passes in conditions that made his bones ache just thinking about them. It was the first week of December when he accepted a run through Montana, a delivery that had to reach Billings by morning, and the weather report said snow, but Ray had driven through snow his whole life and he figured he could handle it, and for the first few hours he was right. The roads were slick but manageable and his truck was steady and he thought maybe he would get there early, but then the storm hit like a wall and everything changed in an instant. The snow came down so fast and so thick that his headlights were useless, just white light reflecting off a curtain of white, and the wind shook his cab so hard he had to grip the wheel with both hands, and he knew he should pull over but there was no shoulder, just mountain on one side and a drop on the other, and so he kept crawling forward at 10 miles an hour praying he didn't hit ice. He hit ice, because of course he did, because that's what happens when you push too hard into a storm that doesn't care about your schedule or your bills or the birthday present you promised yourself you would send, and the moment his tires lost traction everything slowed down like time was giving him one last chance to see it all clearly, the way his truck swung toward the edge, the way his hands yanked the wheel too hard, the way the whole world tilted and rolled and there was nothing he could do but hold on. The truck went off the road and down an embankment and Ray hit his head on the window and everything went dark, and when he woke up he was upside down in the cab with his seatbelt cutting into his chest and blood dripping from somewhere above his eye, and outside there was only white and cold and silence, and he knew immediately that no one was coming, no one even knew where he was, and he couldn't move his legs because something was pinning them down, and every time he tried to shift, pain shot up through his whole body like lightning. He tried his radio but it was dead, and his phone had no signal because of course it didn't, and the cold was already seeping in through the broken windshield and he could see his breath and feel his fingers going numb, and for the first time in a very long time Ray Colton was truly afraid, not of dying, because he had made peace with that possibility years ago, but of dying alone, of disappearing in the snow and never being found, of becoming just another story about a trucker who took a bad route and never came home. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, he couldn't tell anymore. The cold made everything slow and heavy, and he started to drift, started to see things that probably weren't there, faces of people he had loved, places he had been, moments he wished he could do over, and he thought about his daughter and how she would feel when she found out, and he thought about the fox and how strange it was that a memory from months ago was the clearest thing in his mind. And then somewhere in the haze of fading consciousness he heard something, a scratching sound, a yipping, a sound so familiar it made him open his eyes even though they wanted to stay closed. Through the cracked windshield he saw a shape in the snow, small and red and impossible, a fox standing just a few feet away, staring at him with eyes that caught the moonlight like two small flames, and at first Ray thought he was hallucinating, thought his dying brain was just replaying the last moment of his life that had felt meaningful, but then the fox moved, it padded closer, it sniffed at the broken glass, and when Ray whispered hey, his voice barely more than a croak, the fox didn't run, it sat down in the snow and watched him like it was waiting for him to do something. Ray didn't know what he expected to happen. He was pinned and broken and freezing, and a wild fox wasn't going to magically call for help, but something about its presence made him fight, made him reach for the radio one more time, made him twist his body despite the pain and feel around for anything he could use to free himself, and that's when he found the emergency beacon buried under the dash, a device he had installed years ago and never used. And with shaking fingers he pressed the button, and felt it click and prayed that someone, somewhere, was listening. The fox stayed with him. That's the part that still amazes people when he tells this story, because wild animals don't do that. They don't sit in the freezing cold next to a dying man for hours just to keep him company. But this one did. It stayed curled near the windshield like a sentinel, like a guardian, and every time Ray started to drift off again he would hear it yip or see its tail flick, and it would pull him back to the surface, back to the cold that hurt but also meant he was still alive. Search and rescue found him 6 hours later because of the beacon, and when they pulled him out of the cab and loaded him into the helicopter they said it was a miracle he was still breathing. And Ray wanted to tell them about the fox, but when he looked back toward the wreck the animal was gone, just paw prints in the snow leading off into the trees, and he knew then, he knew without any proof and without any logical explanation, that it was the same fox, that the creature he had saved from the fire had somehow found him and stayed with him and kept him alive long enough to be rescued. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital after that, broken ribs, punctured lung, frostbite on 2 fingers that he almost lost, but he survived, and every day he lay in that bed he thought about loyalty, about the idea that kindness might actually echo back through the world in ways we can't predict, and he thought about how he had felt so alone for so many years, and yet in his darkest moment a wild animal had refused to let him die alone. His daughter came to visit him in the hospital, the first time he had seen her in 2 years, and she held his hand and cried and told him she was sorry they had drifted apart, and he told her it wasn't her fault, it was his. He had spent too many years running from the things that mattered, and maybe it took almost dying in a snowstorm to remind him that the only thing worth driving toward was the people who loved him. When he finally got out of the hospital he didn't go back to long-haul trucking, he took a job closer to Portland, shorter routes, more time at home, more time with his granddaughter who had just started calling him Papa Ray, and sometimes on quiet mornings he would sit on the porch with his coffee and look at the trees and think about that fox, and he didn't know if it was still alive or where it had gone, but he knew it had given him something he couldn't repay, a reminder that even when you feel invisible the kindness you put into the world doesn't disappear, it just waits, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, until you need it back. Ray doesn't tell this story often, but when he does he always ends it the same way. He says that people spend so much time wondering if their actions matter, if anyone notices, if anyone cares, and the answer is yes, always yes, because the good you do doesn't fade, it grows, it finds its way back to you in forms you could never imagine, sometimes through a stranger, sometimes through family, and sometimes through a small red fox who remembered a moment of compassion and chose not to let it end in the snow. So if you've ever felt like your kindness doesn't matter, I hope this story reminds you that it does, because somewhere out there the good you've done is still alive, still moving, still waiting for the moment you need it most. Comment loyalty if you believe that kindness always finds its way back, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it today, because we all need a reminder that we are never as alone as we feel, and sometimes the ones who save us aren't the ones we expect, they're the ones who remember what we did when we thought no one was watching.